grabbing on you, dude. Let me the go, man.
All you have to do is cooperate.
You're hurting baby me.
If you are worried.
Officer Elizabeth Montoya was fired from the San Antonio Police Department in early 2019 after she hit a pregnant woman 7 times in the head while being handcuffed.
Spread your legs.
Right here, and I won't do it.
The trouble begins when Montoya asks the defendant to spread her legs to do a weapons search. The officer seems to be annoyed that the defendant, Ms. Kimberly Esparza, doesn't spread her legs as wide as she wants to, and keeps insisting for the defendant to do so. Now, most people might not have a problem with such a request, but Mrs. Esparza is 6 months pregnant and does let Officer Montoya know about it. This should have been time for cooler heads to prevail, and the officer should have made an attempt to defuse the situation, but instead kept trying to show her authority over Miss Esparza. Officer Montoya starts applying a more aggressive technique, holding down the defendant's arms, to which Ms. Esparza screams in pain that she is hurting her baby.
I'm not grabbing on you, dude. Let me the go, man.
All you have to do is cooperate.
You're hurting baby me.
If you were worried about it, you wouldn't be out stealing
You don't know
or
what
taking Xanax either.
Although certain situations do in fact require police officers to be more aggressive, especially with violent or bigger defendants, the fact that Mrs. Esparza is skinnier than all of the officers on scene should have been a clue that no enhanced arresting technique was needed in this situation. This is where things get real physical, where this female officer threatens to break this pregnant woman's arm. Such behaviors violate the principle of professional conduct, ethical standards, and basic human rights. The defendant is placed on the ground, belly down, after repeatedly telling the officers she was pregnant. To anyone viewing this that has gone through a pregnancy, would relate how extremely uncomfortable it is for a pregnant woman to be laying on her stomach, and something that is not recommended by doctors. Ms. Esparza repeatedly asked the officer why she hit her, and Officer Mendoza has the balls to reply, "Because you deserve it."
Yes, she kicked me and she wasn't following me my instructions. If you were pregnant, then you would behave. Grab her arm so I can finish searching.
Unless there is another video out there flowing about this police encounter, nothing that has happened yet would require the officer to hit the defendant. The officer, at this point, threatens to break Miss Esparza's arms, as the officer claims the defendant is kicking her. But how is this possible when someone is lying down on their belly? Also, did I mention there are 3 more officers on the scene, and none of them are acting in this violent manner? Officer Montoya clearly has lost her composure and should have been relieved of duty by a superior officer on the spot.
Don't grab her, let her go. Do not kick me. If you kick me again, I swear to God, I'll break your arm.
The officer finally gets the woman inside the cop car, but this is when this outcome took a downward spiral. While the defendant is sitting in the car, handcuffed. Remember, there are some words exchanged between the 2 women, and as the officer is about to close the door, the defendant's legs get caught on the door. This infuriated Officer Montoya and proceeds to hit Ms. Esparza, which remember is pregnant, in the head, a total of 7 times.
It's not going to have anything to do with me, sweetheart.
You tried me on the floor! Watch out! What's wrong? Why did you hit me like that?
Because you deserve it.
Even if the defendant instigated the fight, something Ms. Esparza refuted, the officers could have easily just shoved her inside the car and closed the door behind, but instead chose to make an example out of this pregnant woman and continued their aggressive mistreatment of Mrs. Esparza.
Kicking me!
I didn't kick you!
Stop kicking me! Get on the ground!
You punched me like 10 times on my fucking... Please!
Get on the ground!
Please don't do this
Get
to
on
me.
the ground!
What's wrong? Why did you hit me like that?
Because you deserve it!
The female officer starts telling her side of the story, but watches as none of her colleagues want anything to do with what just happened. As a police officer, you are held to a higher standard and should avoid the use of force, especially against individuals with a physical condition like Mia Esparza, and instead defuse the situation.
Yeah, she always kept trying to put her arm in. She went like that, her leg, and she kicked me. She kicked me when I was holding her too. I was gonna punch her in her side because that's what I normally do. Huh? I don't know. 320. Can we call the wagon out there?
As a final FU, Officer Montoya claimed that the defendant is faking her injuries as other officers are attending her wounds. This female officer should have been asked to stand down from this interaction a long time ago. As far as I know, every cop in this police interaction is guilty of failing to address the unprofessionalism of Officer Montoya.
She's fine, she's faking it. Look, her eyes are open. As soon as I said that, she opened her eyes.
In 2019, Officer Montoya got fired for her job from the San Antonio Police Department after the lawyers for Ms. Esparza requested a copy of the body camera, and all charges against the defendant were dropped. Another female officer in this interaction got suspended for 3 days for muting her body camera during the encounter. This case loudly screams the need for police reform to prevent such acts of injustice from happening again. How is it possible that officers have the ability to just mute or turn off their camera at their will? This is something we have seen in previous videos and something I can assure you will see again.
I told her to turn around and spread your legs. So when she spread them, she only spread them like this, which isn't far enough for me to check. I was like, spread your legs. She's like, my hip hurts. I was like, spread your legs. So she's not following my instructions. So I'm assuming she's got something on her, and she like tries to spin on me. I'm like, that's enough. So I grab her arm and I push her up against the car.
In deposition, Officer Montoya claimed that she was afraid of being spit or headbutted, which is why she pushed Ms. Esparza head to the side inside the police patrol while trying to buckle her, and this triggered the violent interaction between the two women. In total, 7 punches to the head and 1 to her breast were recorded. In the police report, it reads that Ms. Esparza was left laying down on her back for 26 minutes in heavy rain until first responders arrived.
Am I gonna need to go to the hospital or anything? No, I'll be all right. When she kicked me, yeah, if I can hurt, she kicked me. And like I said, I let it go the first time, not the second time.
While in police custody, they have the moral, legal, and ethical responsibilities to care for your well-being. An Officer Montoya priority should have been focused on the fact this person was pregnant, in handcuffs, and non-threatening instead of focusing on how wide her legs were spread out. In a slap to our justice system, Officer Montoya was hired by another police department while she waited to go on to arbitration in regards to this case. Police arbitration basically means that an officer gets to tell her side of the story to an independent third-party group of people outside the police department or city council. These types of clauses are written in police union contracts in order to help officers stay in the jobs, and sadly for everyone in this community, and especially for Ms. Esparza, the arbitrator reinstated Officer Montoya back into her old job at the San Antonio Police Department. During arbitration, another female cop testified that the 7 punches to the head were compliance strikes. We always talk about the power that police officers have, but it's worth pointing out that what grants these officers some of these powers is the contracts written by their police unions, which have all the incentive to defend even cops that should not be defended. This should sicken everyone watching this video and demand more police accountability and transparency for the sake of our rights and liberties.